senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council at the Brent Scowcroft Center, and I have the privilege of serving as your moderator for our afternoon panel, NATO's Deterrent Posture, Nuclear, Conventional, and Missile Defense. And let me start by, of course, thanking our partners in crime here, the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. It's been a great relationship with them, and then also for the sponsorship that the Norwegian Ministry of Defense has provided us for this conference and this series. We started this morning with a focus on asymmetric threats. Our panel in the morning talked about cyber, terrorism, energy, and space. Barry Pavel talked about a post-Westphalian world. And then over lunch, we were drifted back into the current realm of contemporary operations, and we had a provocative statement by Ivo Daalder on a more traditional, long-standing dimension of deterrence with nuclear weapons. And that, of course, is going to be one of the foci of our panel, which is focusing on those long-standing, but I would argue nonetheless relevant set of deterrence challenges and tools: nuclear forces, conventional forces, and missile defense. And I have to remind myself, because missile defense often looks so new, but it actually dates back to the 1950s when we started, the United States started first testing and then in the 60s deploying missile defense interceptors. These capabilities have been in the past, and many would argue, been the backbone of NATO's deterrence capacity. Indeed, the alliance's own statements state that Allied confidence in these elements is critical to alliance cohesion. So it's only prudent, particularly in a dynamic environment, a dynamic strategic environment, to constantly check these tools and update them, update their postures and their doctrines. And it was discussed in our last session. NATO did that with its Deterrence and Defense Posture Review of May 2012. And it concluded, quote, "The alliance's existing mix of capabilities and the plans for their development are sound." Well, our goal today and this afternoon is in some ways to revalidate that assessment and to retest some of its assertions and explore where further progress can be made, either to enhance or adjust as needed these key elements, all with an eye to the 2014 summit. Indeed, we need to think about how they would fit into what Damon Wilson calls NATO's fifth chapter. These reviews may actually be needed to be done more frequently in light of the many changing dynamics that we're facing, the increasing rapidity of change. But there are four that capture my mind. One, something that Ivo talked a lot about, which is Europe's declining military capabilities, a process that seems to be ongoing, and we don't see any foreseeable real reversal in that. Second is a withdrawal from Europe of significant U.S. combat capability over the last several years. Third is a rising instability, and we talked about this along the Maghreb. Most notably, the crisis in Syria underscores kind of threats that are immediate to some of our allies, notably Turkey. And then a risk of looking a little bit Paleolithic, there's a fourth concern on my mind. And that's the growing risk that flows from changes going on in Russia. This is a country that features a disturbing mix of internal conflict, rising xenophobia, virulent nationalism, coupled with an increasingly assertive foreign policy that is backed by growing military capabilities. We mentioned today Steadfast Jazz, a NATO exercise of 6,000, a major undertaking, major collective defense exercise. Compare that to Zapad 2013, which took place in October. That involved 70,000 troops, strategic bombers, maritime landings, a launch of an Iskander missile. That's exponentially a lot larger than a Steadfast Jazz. Now, I'm not saying it signals a new full-to-back confrontation, but it does give credence to those who are concerned and who are asking about whether or not NATO is giving adequate consideration to those contingencies on its eastern frontier that can involve a fast-breaking political crisis that could precipitate a limited territorial incursion by Russia. Should that be part of the deterrence equation that we consider when we look at NATO's future? To help us assess how NATO is exercising its nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities and how these relate to the new deterrence challenges of the 21st century, we have an outstanding panel here of current and former policymakers and commanders. Marilyn Creedon in the center is the Assistant Secretary for Global Strategic Affairs. She took that position in August of 2012. In that capacity, she and her office oversee policy development and execution in the areas of countering weapons of mass destruction, U.S. nuclear forces and missile defense, but also the Department of Defense's activities in cyber and space. She also, I might add, chairs the high-level group NATO's high-level group on nuclear issues. And what I like best as a former Hill staffer, she brings 10 years of experience from Capitol Hill, from the Senate Armed Services Committee, in which much of that was spent as de facto the staff director of the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. Walt Slocum, to my immediate right here, I know him always and first and foremost as the Secretary of the Atlantic Council, but his day job is the Senior Counsel for Kaplan and Drysdale, a law firm. He served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Clinton. And since then, he's been involved in numerous senior government commissions, including relevant today, the Commission on Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction. He recently sat on the congressionally mandated National Academy of Sciences study, Making Sense of Ballistic Missile Defense, that came out in 2012. To his right is General James Cartwright, who is now at CSIS, where he holds the Harold Brown Chair in Defense Policy Studies. He brings, and I hope I have this right, but a 4-decade, because when you look at you, you look so young, but a 4-decade career in the Marines. He was an aviator in the Marine Corps, but what's unique in his Marine career is I believe he was the only Marine who served as a commander of the U.S. Strategic Command. He culminated his military career, not in the too distant past, as the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position he held across 2 administrations, and that was noted for his innovation in the areas of strategic deterrence, nuclear proliferation, missile defense, and cybersecurity. And at the end, we have Kurt Volker, a longtime colleague and friend of mine, Ambassador Volker, who is the Executive Director at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. He brings 23 years of service to our country in the Foreign Service, with a number of senior NATO positions, NATO-related positions. The last in his career was a U.S. permanent representative to NATO, or ambassador to NATO. He's also served as on the National Security Council staff as a senior director for Europe, as a principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Europe and Eurasian affairs, and as part of his Foreign Service career, he actually served in the NATO headquarters as a deputy chief of staff to NATO Secretary General, then Lord Robertson. And immediately his left is General Pat O'Reilly, a new non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center. He comes from us from the Missile Defense Agency, which he led as his last post in the military. He has a long career of command and staff officer positions on both sides of the Atlantic. He is not just brawn, he's also a lot of brains. He taught, he has senior degrees in physics, taught physics at the United States Military Academy, and in the missile defense realm, he has led the programs that have produced directed energy programs, the Patriot PAC-3, THAAD, and the GBI, the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense Program. So he begins intense operational, developmental, and programmatic experience in missile defense. We're all very welcome to have you here. I'm going to start off with Madeline, and we'll work through our panelists, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. Madeline, last June in Berlin, the president rolled out, delivered a major speech in which a key element of it is he called for dramatic reductions in U.S. and Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Is now the time really to further that process, further evolve NATO's nuclear posture? And if so, how should that evolution be related to efforts to manage other more asymmetric threats?
Thanks, Ian. And again, thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. It really is a pleasure to be here. I think your question really reflects on a lot of the work that is certainly going on in parallel between NATO and also the U.S. So in June, the culmination of the oh-so-much longer 90-day study resulted in the issuance of new presidential decision guidance on nuclear employment policy. And that guidance really was the result of a very long and exhaustive process that allowed the U.S. to come to the conclusion that we could very safely, in conjunction with Russia, go to about 1/3 fewer deployed strategic nuclear systems. At the same time, since NATO put out its DDPR, NATO and specifically the HLG, which, as Ian mentioned, I have the privilege of chairing, and having done a lot of work with my colleague from Norway here in the front row. But the HLG has done a tremendous amount of work in updating the NATO guidance, and so for the very first time since 1992, the HLG provided a new political guidance for for NATO, which then was recently followed by some implementing guidance for both the military staff and for SHAPE. So with these two new guidance documents in place, and in NATO, and then with the U.S. PPD in place, both of them have now set the stage, set the strategy for what are really more the 21st century threats. So not Cold War, but the real threats, the different threats, the evolving threats, the ballistic missile threats from the shorter and the medium range systems, looking at how you both maintain a strong deterrent, a credible deterrent, at the same time setting the conditions for future reductions. So all of this is going on in both NATO and the US. So it's important to have Russia as part of this effort on both sides. Neither one of these efforts will be successful without it. You know, to be frank, we're not making much progress on that front, but we'll continue to try. Thanks.
Walt. And by the way, I might add that Walt will have to leave at 2:15, so hopefully he'll be getting up not in protest, but because he's got a plane to catch. Walt, do you see a need for a more radical change to the alliance's nuclear posture? Do you see a need for a tighter link between that posture and its conventional deterrence?
Well, I think it is important that the United States actually modernize the strategic force. You can argue about on what pace, how big it needs to be, and so on. And there may well be an argument about whether we should, in fact, continue to maintain a ground-based ICBM force. But I think the core of NATO nuclear deterrence remains the U.S. strategic nuclear deterrent. It's also true, mutatis mutandis, of the British and French forces, both of which are committed to be modernized, although there will be debates, at least in Britain, about on what scale. It's always a pleasure to agree with Ivo, and I'm also one of those who has real reservations about the military utility of the dual-capable aircraft in Europe. I mean, the most dramatic way to put it is if, heaven forfend, we ever got into a condition in which the alliance wanted to use nuclear weapons, given a choice between invulnerable submarines with an essentially, and other systems, with an essentially 100% assurance of reaching the target and very high precision, would we reject them in favor of air-breathing airplanes with pilots in them that may even have to be refueled on certain missions, dropping gravity bombs? On the assumption that the Russians, or somebody else, it's hard to imagine targets other than the Russians that are relevant in this context, that the Russians would be pacified by the fact that the airplanes came from European bases and not from American, British, or French platforms. That said, I think the central point about nuclear weapons in NATO is that they're not primarily military forces. They are primarily political, in some sense. Deterrence is political because it involves shaping the adversary's decision. They're also political in the sense of serving purposes far beyond what they could do if they were ever used. And in this context, we should never forget the horrible consequences of the use of nuclear weapons on any scale. I mean, but for some Europeans, the commitment of American nuclear weapons in Europe, for reasons that you can argue whether they ever made sense, you can certainly argue whether they make sense now, but very definitely, are seen as a fundamental symbol of American commitment. There are a lot of Europeans in the room, and I apologize for saying this, but the Europeans tend to operate in two modes, and they can, like angels, can move from one to the other in infinitesimal time without passing through the intervening space. One is that the Americans are about to embroil them in stupid conflicts in which they have no interest, and the other is that the Americans are about to abandon them and leave them open to their enemies. To some degree, things like the presence of US nuclear weapons in Europe help with that. I think in some ways they are also important as a symbol of alliance solidarity. Awkward, maybe not efficient, maybe not the way you do it if you had to do it all over again, but in some sense the fact that they are there is some role, at least for some of them, for European forces as well as American. They are in some sense under a dual key. That has a political significance. I have reluctantly come to the conclusion, well, it is no secret that the United States Air Force has wanted to get rid of these things for years and years and years. Frank Miller and I suspect my successors our successors over the years, have had to go down and throw ourselves in front of the United States Air Force, which would save money, and say this will be the end of the world, it'll be the collapse of NATO. And since it's only a relatively modest amount of money out of something between $500 and $700 billion, they've stayed. So I think that's, for the foreseeable future, a fight about this issue is not worth it. I think, however, there are things that we should be doing to prepare, maybe to prepare for an eventual reduction. And if, God willing, the Russians were to agree and there was going to be some substantial reduction in Russian non-strategic forces, the politics of the issue would change. I think there's some things we should do. One is, there was a time when there was no secret about it. There was a time, and I'm honestly not sure whether it's still true, where there was a formal commitment of some of the US and in principle all of the British submarine force to NATO. That's a force which in military terms is much more relevant, and I think we should, if that is not the existing arrangement today, we should ask very seriously why not. Second, I'm glad that Madeleine is the chair of the HLG, and I'm sure it's a very important instrument at the kind of, I was always pleased that that level was called the working level, implied that there are other kinds of levels in the alliance. The NATO planning group, however, which was very important at one point, at least in my experience, the meeting, it was late in the meeting, everybody wanted lunch or or being Europeans, a cigarette, and the briefing went up and it was warmly received as a sign of how much the Americans were consulting the Europeans. I think one of the things which ought to be done to educate at least the NATO community about some of the realities of nuclear weapons is to revive and make more serious the nuclear planning group, and really to involve Europeans. There are very few good things about what Mr. Snowden did, but one is, let's hope we will stop lecturing the Europeans about how lousy their security is, so we can't tell them things that you could get out of the newspapers. Much more openness about some of the realities of nuclear weapons. Because I think a core issue for nuclear policy in NATO is that it is understood and broadly understood within the alliance. And I'm not sure that despite all the excellent work that's being done by specialized people, that is in fact the case. As far as linking NATO's nuclear forces to conventional forces, I'm not sure I understand the question. But one of the real divisions within the alliance on nuclear policy is, do we regard nuclear weapons as almost, if not exclusively, if not exclusively, for the deterrence of nuclear attack, or is there some connection to conventional forces? I gotta say, in spite of all the problems about declining capabilities, it is hard for me to imagine a situation in which NATO as a whole would not have the conventional capability to deal with any circumstance in which it would arise for Article 5 defense, and therefore the question of using nuclear weapons in the response to a conventional aggression doesn't arise. On the other hand, I can also understand the argument that if you were to make a formal no first use pledge, you would convince the people who depended on you for their defense that you were telling the truth, without necessarily convincing the people whom you were about to attack, who were about to attack you.
Great. We have a pretty strong lobby here, it strikes me, in terms of questioning kind of the operation utility of nuclear weapons. But let me move to the kind of conventional domain and ask General Cartwright, what are the
only the operational utility
of those nuclear weapons? General Cartwright, what are the contingencies that should drive NATO's planning and posture regarding conventional threats? And how do you link them to nuclear deterrence and the deterrence of these new asymmetric threats that we discussed earlier this morning and this afternoon?
I find myself in a very uncomfortable position in that I so strongly agree with Ivo and Madeline and Walt that I'm having a hard time coming up with a good argument of why they're wrong. But the one thing that I would point out, and we don't need to get into Russia bashing here, but it is very clear in the current constructs of the New START and the levels that we have committed to there, and then the potential to come down another third from that, the vector that we're on, one, and two, that the Russians are far ahead of us in compliance. And so while we're saying we're not going to do something without consultation, et cetera, the Russians are far ahead of us in compliance with the current treaties, ahead of us being the United States. And so, I want to make that, known. Second thing that concerns me is, and I find myself kind of where Harlan's question from this morning of, should we rename deterrence? There are a lot of terms that have baggage in their definitional genre that leave us having a difficult conversation and often talking past each other. Extended deterrence, deterrence, strategic, all of these have with them a set of meetings that almost always take you immediately to nuclear. And the question is, in the realities of the world we live in, and I know we want to kind of, like all normal humans, live in denial to some extent, but in grand strategy, what's really being said in the US and in NATO and Europe and other places in the world is that we do not have the financial means for the aspirations that we have for our national security. I mean, it's just not matched up. We can't afford, as the United States, the standing armies that we currently have to keep them standing forever, number one. Number two, the recapitalization of the nuclear force that we have today in a form that is exactly like it is today is unaffordable. And so we've got to come to some understanding collectively about what our aspirations actually are and what of those aspirations are realizable. And that's been a difficult discussion. There's another piece here that, from a conventional standpoint, we in the United States have been a global power, forward-based, forward-operating. More and more countries, mostly all countries, do not want large American armies on their soil. That's a reality. The cost to have those forces every place in the world on mobile platforms is unaffordable. So we have a disconnect in aspiration and in the reality of the resources that we have. That's just, we can live in denial of that, but we're also living in the reality of it day to day when you look at the reductions in forces that are going on. The good news is if you go back to the world wars for NATO, the United States, not NATO, but Europe, we fought those as armies. We put together armies and we fought against our foes. If you come forward to the Cold War, we fought as divisions. That's how we thought about the Cold War. That's about how we constructed forces, etc. You come forward to the current conflicts, we're fighting them as brigades. In other words, the mobility, the lethality, the capabilities of the forces today are substantially better than they have been in the past. Most people will look at precision in conventional arms and say, oh, that's the ability to hit your target precisely, know exactly what you're aiming at, and hit it. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The reality of what precision really brought us is the number of trucks and people and equipment on the battlefield today is exponentially lower than it was in the past. That's the real realization. What is it about the future that's going to allow us to match the reality of the resources we have and are willing to put against our security and the capabilities that we can actually field with those resources? Where are we going to find what I would call cost inversions, the ability to do what we want with the resources we actually have, not just to wish for something else? And from my perspective, strategic, not in the sense of nuclear, as we always have thought about it, but in the sense of some of the things we need to do are a long ways away and yet are urgent and must be done now. Some of the things that we need to do are right next door and are equally time sensitive and must be dealt with right now, and we won't be there physically to do it. How do we start to think about a construct of defense for NATO, particularly when you're looking at countries in NATO that are more threatened than other countries, that allow us to have great strategic reach at very quick speeds and not have that be what it is today, only nuclear? And how are we going to think about our next door neighbor attacking us and being able to close with that problem very quickly and put it into a position where we can have more decision time and more capability? How are we going to think about those kinds of activities? And there are new capabilities out there in missile defense and in other areas that are going to allow us to start to move in that direction, but they're not real yet. So what is the aspiration that we have for these vexing problems? And the thought process in the past, the taxonomy was, the first thing I'll do is I'll use my my conventional forces. And then if that fails, I'll use my strategic forces. I tell you it's going to turn around. Don't think about it in a nuclear sense. But you're going to have to think strategic first, coming from great distance or no distance to solve a problem. And last, you're going to think about your conventional forces and moving and the huge cost of standing armies and moving them to the problem. I mean, it's just the reality we're going to have to deal with. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to afford it? Those are the questions I think we're going to have to, as an alliance, come to grips with and understand how we're going to do that. Otherwise, we will not be matching our resources and our capabilities with the security that we desire to have.
Thank you.
Other than that, I'm in a good place.
Well, that kind of leads me to Kurt, because Kurt dealt firsthand with this type of issue, which is dealing with NATO contingency planning. And he was involved, if not leading the effort, to bring kind of dose of reality to NATO contingency planning, make it actually occur when it concerns particularly Central Europe. When you hear the other speakers, particularly General Cartwright's point about, we need to be able to exercise and leverage increasing speed and deployability of our forces. Do you see this happening in NATO? Is NATO positioning itself right now to leverage the deployability of its forces so that it can provide an adequate deterrent against threats from both near and far?
Straight up the alley, soft pitch. Got it. So here's the way I want to answer that, if I can, and I want to shake it up a little bit. It's terrible if everyone agrees with each other. Deterrence is when someone who is your potential adversary decides not to bother because they know it's not going to work. So we are deterring two things successfully. The U.S. nuclear deterrent is deterring anyone from thinking about even contesting U.S. nuclear dominance. It's just off the table. That's good. We should be happy about that there is no nuclear challenger out there. That extends to NATO. This is Walt's point. That extends to NATO as a U.S. guarantee of NATO, but it's only credible if we have the linkage to NATO allies bearing some of this nuclear burden of the policy of nuclear deterrence as well. He's right operationally, but the burden of that politics of nuclear strategy has to be there, or else it's not credible that Europe is part of that nuclear strategy. And it also starts to raise questions, does the US nuclear deterrent really extend? So that's why that's important. The other thing we're deterring is a conventional attack on the territory of European members. There, I think, and what are the components of deterrence? The components are capability, will, both individual and collective, your track record, and your messaging. These are all lined up perfectly on an attack against NATO territory by conventional means. Everybody knows, no one has a doubt, NATO can and will respond to that. Now, the flip side is we're not deterring anything else. We're not deterring the Taliban from attacking us in Afghanistan or from trying to overthrow the government. We're not deterring Assad from killing his own people. We're not deterring Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon. We're not deterring North Korea from pursuing a nuclear weapon. And we're not deterring terrorists from trying to attack us wherever they can. So those things, deterrence is not working there. And what do we see on the horizon now? This is where you need to bring in this planning question that Ian raised. We are all cutting our defense budgets, including the US. We are withdrawing US forces from Europe. We are not talking about, in serious ways, what to do about crises outside of European territory, whether it's Syria or follow-on in Libya or Egypt, or what to do about Iran. We talk about missile defense, but we don't talk about against whom and what the issue is there. So we are in the process of eroding a lot of the capacity. And in what we are projecting to the rest of the world, we are projecting an erosion of will. So this has some serious implications for our ability to keep this deterrence up. The US strategic nuclear deterrence I'm not so worried about as long as we keep that small nuclear linkage with Europe. But I am worried about NATO's credibility for the sake of conventional deterrence. Will we continue to convince people that if there's any thought of an attack on NATO member territory, that will be immediately met and dealt with? I think we risk, as we cut our own capabilities and we talk about not being willing to do things and project power, that question can start to creep up in people's minds. And since my friend, the former Georgian ambassador to the US, just walked in the door, I'll mention an example of this. We were having a discussion at NATO after Russia invaded Georgia. And a comment from one of the larger allies was that, thank goodness we didn't invite Georgia to join NATO, because then we would have shown that Article 5 isn't real, because of course we wouldn't have gone to defend them. And that's the kind of backwards logic that's really dangerous if NATO starts to think that way. And that's why, if I were to point a way forward, we have to do the things, we have to do the things that are necessary to keep the conventional deterrent credible. Have military forces that are actually available, plan for when they might be used, and exercise that use. And I slightly disagree with some of the comments earlier today about the importance of the expeditionary roles. I don't think you can agree in advance on what expeditionary role we might go off and do. It's kind of like, in Bosnia. We never talked about going to Bosnia. But if you do your homework on your Article 5 real capabilities, they're there when you need them. And that's the way I think we need to think about this.
Great, thank you, Kurt. General O'Reilly, could you talk to us a little bit about how missile defense fits into both the deterrence of nuclear threats, but also conventional threats from an alliance perspective?
Well, I think it's very hard to make a distinction between the two, because the missile defense systems are set up to counter missiles unknowing what's in the payload. Whether it's a weapon of mass destruction, we don't know while they're launched. So, but the threat is there's obviously some intent to do harm or the missile wouldn't be launched in the first place. So I believe there's an ambiguity that's going to stay when a missile's launched, whether or not to put them into a nuclear strategic sense or a conventional attack. Probably the greatest indicator would be the range of the missiles that you're looking at. Unfortunately, as we've been talking about today about the relevancy of the NATO missions for the future, in the area of missile defense, the proliferation and the threat of ballistic missiles, unfortunately, is not static. And a lot of reviews were done 4 years ago. Architecture was developed with NATO and the United States. I believe if you've looked since then, The greater concerns or growing concerns is the emergence of user-friendly, if I may say, ballistic missiles that are available to non-state actors. Number two would be the emergence of the anti-ship ballistic missile and the possession of countries around the world where you can actually affect commerce from a great distance. And third would be, along the lines of your question, is a continued development of long-range missiles by Iran with the potential capability of hitting the United States. And when you look at that mission or those threats, as was just said, we have to have a capability, some way to respond to protect those interests. And those are long-term commitments and developments. So I honestly believe that the answer to your question is you have to be prepared to engage missiles without knowing ahead of time of what the threat actually is.
Let me throw a question to you that's almost another softball, because you've written about this. But what are ways in which the Europeans can contribute more to U.S. homeland defense when it comes to protecting U.S. homeland against ballistic missile threats?
Well, in the case of U.S. homeland defense, about 60 to 70% of a trajectory of a missile where we're concerned about coming from the Middle East towards the United States is over European territory or non-U.S. NATO territory. So in the 70% of that flight, there is a tremendous amount of data that we would greatly be able to leverage with our own homeland defense system that we currently do not have access to, yet there are sensors in Europe today that could make tremendous contributions to U.S. missile defense.
Could you be more specific on specifically what some of the sensors are?
Well, there's a network. Several countries have space object tracking sensors, very precise. When you attempt an intercept of missiles coming in, a lot of those sensors are in locations that would be able to give you very accurate assessments of whether you were successful or not, much earlier than just relying on U.S. sensors where they're located. And then there's a growing emergence of mobile sensors that are in NATO, especially on board the ships, L-band, S-band, a whole array of frequencies out there that, number one, make it much more difficult to counter when you're facing a network like that, and two, adds a lot of robustness. So there's not a single vulnerable node. And so I believe there's a tremendous amount of contribution that could be made, and in the period of austerity that we're looking at right now, these are not expensive undertakings to link these sensors to a U.S. NATO system, and would greatly enhance the whole network.
Yes, Madeline, a question follows from Kerry's visit to Poland, because it also follows from missile defense. When he was in Poland, he said that the U.S. commitment to build the EPAA site in Poland 2018 is ironclad. Does that mean that the Obama speech in Prague, or a provision of the Obama speech in Prague 2009, in which he said it was an agreement with Iran over its nuclear weapons program, if that were to be achieved robustly, that there would be a rethinking of EPAA? Is EPA now totally locked in, and that provision of the Prague speech no longer valid?
So we've made a substantial commitment to EPAA, to Homeland Missile Defense, and to the Nuclear Strategic Deterrent. So when the department went through its Strategic Choices Management Review, those were among the three, plus cyber and space capabilities, that were going to be highlighted and protected and preserved. And part and parcel of that, and as we've gone through the various budget deliberations, it becomes really hard even to protect those things that you want to protect. And EPA is clearly one of those things that we really want to protect. And so we've done so far a pretty good job of protecting phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Obviously, we canceled phase 4. But I think that's really where there is a connection between your question and Iran. Okay, so we saw a more rapidly emergent North Korean threat, and moved some resources and some assets to go after that more emergent, more near-term threat, the long-term threat from North Korea, to put additional 14 GBIs in Alaska, and then also begin to look at how to improve the capabilities of that EKV, okay? And so we were able to do that because, frankly, that long-range threat from Iran hadn't emerged on the timetable that we thought it would emerge. And so we were able to take some of the phase 4 concepts and move that to Alaska. That said, we know, because they test them all the time and we know they have lots of them, we do have a no kidding real threat from Iran in the area of the short and the medium and to some extent intermediate range. And so that's what we're going to focus on in EPAA. And those are there and they are real. And that's where the resources are. So the phase 2 groundbreaking, which we just had in Poland, or in Romania rather, and then the upcoming commitment to Poland, which we'll see that completed in 18, that we are definitely committed to that. Those are ironclad because those are real threats. You know, and Iran has those real missiles. I think the bigger question really becomes, and it's not just for EPA, it's really for all of theater defenses, and it's how many defensive systems do you buy to offset how many incoming offensive systems? And that's the question that ultimately we really have to have, because as many have said and looked at this, this is the losing end of a cost-imposing proposition. So, you know, how often, how far do you want to go 1 for 1 or 2 for 2 or however many it is that you need? But that's really the next question. So it's not where is Iran going, it's where is anybody going that has offensive missile capabilities, and how do we think about defending them if we can't always afford that one-on-one or that two-on-one defensive capability? That's the question. It's a much bigger question than Iran.
Is that equivalent to saying that regardless if we have a massive rapprochement with Iran, we're still going to need missile defense capability, and so therefore those sites in Eastern Europe that the United States is building are always going to be there?
You know, define that that agreement with Iran. Define what that looks like. You know, we no longer treat Russia as an enemy, but they still possess nuclear weapons, and so we still have nuclear weapons. So so define that box, and then we'll define our capabilities vis-a-vis that particular box of capabilities.
Let me turn to Walt on missile defense, because you were part of that commission that looked at missile defense. NATO's posture is to develop missile defenses, but it's not to orient it against Russia. Why is it impossible to reach out to Russia on missile defense cooperation and simultaneously develop limited capabilities against its ballistic missiles? Because in fact, that's what's happening in NATO today. The Poles are buying an air and missile defense system, and it's not designed against Iran, it's against Russia. Why should NATO be contributing to that effort? And why would that necessarily undermine NATO's relationship with the alliance? Particularly in light of the fact, when you look at some of Russian exercises, they heavily emphasize nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technologies.
Well, it's not that you can't develop a missile which will shoot down a target with Cyrillic writing on it. It's that the Russians have the capability, for exactly the reason that was just mentioned, to overwhelm any plausible defense. So the most you can expect, if they want to do it, so missile defenses, particularly for the kind of thing the Poles are building, as I understand it, which is to defend specific targets as well as to try to have some protection for the country as a whole, is to raise the cost of entry, is to make clear that there is some defense, that is, they are not absolutely vulnerable, and you then rely on other measures to deal with the broader question of the conflict. I think that one of the issues that we tend to slide over is that most of the people in this room know it, but most other people don't. NATO actually has, NATO as an institution, distinct from its members, actually has remarkably few military capabilities. AWACS, there used to be a pipeline. Given how expensive it was, I'm not sure, I hope it still exists. And I'm pleased to know that AGS is going to happen someday. But they are national systems. They're designed almost invariably with a national mission and a collective mission. And, as you know, the principle that everything is a national responsibility means that they usually get paid for by the nations, and that therefore the national mission, not an absolute priority, not to the exclusion of others, but it's very important. I must say, and this is the advantage of being entirely out of the government, I'm not 100% clear that if there were, and this is, Madeline's absolutely right, tell me what the agreement with the Iranians is, and I'll tell you what kind of a impact it might have on our defense programs. I find it hard to believe that if there really were a fundamental change in Iranian policy, the United States Congress would be quite so keen on providing the funding for a system which is quite rightly heavily oriented toward the defense of Europe. And there's another question about the relationship of the role of missile defenses that's been addressed indirectly but not explicitly. And you asked General Riley about the relationship between missile defense and conventional deterrence. I believe that the most serious element of the threat from countries like Iran is not that they will decide that they're going to fire off a missile for the hell of it and to wipe out the infidels, or at least a lot of them. It is that they will embark on some regional aggression, which is very much not in our interest, very much very much in our interest to prevent it. And they will hope that their nuclear capability, even if a relatively limited one, is enough to discourage us and to discourage other countries from coming to the assistance of whoever they attack. I think in that sense, missile defense, because it offers the prospect of frustrating that strategy and making it much harder to rely on, I think missile defense makes a major contribution to conventional deterrence, which has nothing to do with actually shooting anything down. It has to do with reducing the capacity to believe that, to quote my good friend Shang Guangkai, the chief barbarian handler in the Chinese military, that you won't trade Los Angeles for Taipei. That I think is in many ways the central role of the kind of limited missile defenses that are practical. As to why, I don't know how many reams of goodwill and paper have been spent on trying to convince the Russians that we would like nothing better than to do things which really, no kidding, cross our hearts and hope to die, will demonstrate that unsurprisingly, maybe a few hundred American interceptor missiles will not defeat thousands of Russian ones, and you usually get a variation on no or no followed by colorful adjectives. But maybe they'll change.
General Cartwright, let me follow on Kurt's point about demonstrating the capacity and political will of the alliance to deal with the deterrence challenges of today and tomorrow. You talked about the mobility, the increased mobility of allied forces. I have the sense that increased mobility may have been demonstrated for expeditionary operations, but I really wonder if the alliance is properly configured today and positioned today to deal with fast-breaking regional contingencies on NATO's border, be it the Baltics, be it Poland, be it Turkey. Am I underestimating NATO's capacity, or is this something that needs to be addressed? And if so, how would you build up that capacity and demonstrate it?
You know, I think first, in the construct that we've been discussing here of nuclear weapons and missile defense, today, if somebody attacks and nobody's around, but it's in the interests of our country or other countries, and it's perceived as some sort of existential threat, then the only response that we have that can get someplace on the other side of the earth quickly is a nuclear weapon. That has proven to be a shortfall in the credibility of our capability to address it. So then you fall to conventional forces. Okay? The beauty in some perverse sense, at least for me, of missile defense is that it has significant ability to bridge where extended deterrence has started to fail us. It has the ability to bridge both strategic long-range and strategic short-range capabilities of an adversary, and to introduce at least doubt into the mind of that adversary, whether they're going to be successful. Okay? Where I agree with Madeline is that we can't afford to get into a game, though, where missile defense is, I'm going to build an interceptor for every missile that you have. That's unreasonable. So we need, short of nuclear, conventional, kinetic, non-kinetic capabilities that have both the capability to reach great distances and short distances very quickly to augment what missile defense can do and to fill in gaps of threats that missile defense will never address. The second thing about missile defense to me that is very important in this context is that, it was alluded to a little earlier, no one country has the geography to have all of the sensors that they're going to need to see the missiles coming. Okay? You have to rely on a coalition. And that binds politically and mission-wise, objective-wise, multiple countries together. And that has a conventional deterrent aspect to it, attribute, a nuclear attribute, and quite frankly, an asymmetric attribute. And so what you're looking at there is a defensive capability that can address strategic to asymmetric, has a political binding attribute to it, but you have to bound it with a capability that says, if you shoot these things at us, one, you're going to be unsure as to whether they're going to get through, and number two, something's coming back your way very quickly, and we don't have to start at the nuclear level to do it. And so that's the force construct that starts to play here.
Could I just add a little bit on that problem? One of the problems that any alliance has is that some people are on the front line and some people are more in the rear. That was the decoupling issue during the Cold War, but it's very much the issue in NATO today. That the countries in Eastern Europe, Turkey, conceivably in the Nordic countries, that are closest to the potential threat, leaving missiles aside, the potential threat of conventional invasion, are relying on the support not only of the United States, but of other more distant countries. Leaving the politics aside for the moment, the problem is, and one of the reasons why there is such interest in retaining at least the option of using nuclear weapons in response to a massive conventional attack, is that those countries understandably are not keen on being liberated after 6 months of heavy fighting. They're interested in the attack not happening or at least being stopped. I think one of the issues that the alliance needs to face is one that we've faced in connection with Korea. That there are sort of two models of how you address an invasion. One is the kind of, at some point you will decide that war is inevitable and you mobilize and you start flowing stuff and everything goes at once. And it's, I mean, you talk about we used to fight in divisions. The idea was we would move 10 divisions to Europe in 10 days. It's a measure of the way this was planned that the first day was spent filling out paperwork. But that was what we were going to do, damn it. One of the things I think that we have to bear in mind to think realistically and seriously about this scenario is that this is extremely unlikely to be an absolute bolt from the blue. There's lots of history of tactical surprise. To my knowledge, there's virtually no history in the last couple of 100 years at least of strategic surprise. That is, of an attack that you had no reason to believe could possibly happen. And I think that, and it will be difficult politically, but critical operationally, that NATO have a plan for reacting to strategic warning in ways that are not jerk the lanyard, move everything forward, mobilize everybody, and so on. We've actually developed for the Korean case, and it's a matter of public record, we've developed a much more sophisticated concept of how you begin which is the classic example of Korea, long way away, America far, enemy close, bad people, how you deal with that, and it is a graduated set of responses. That will be tricky in the NATO context because we have the luxury in the Korean case of having essentially only 2.5 players on our side, us, the South Koreans, and the Japanese, whereas you have 28 plus many others in the European case, and people will make the argument, oh, you mustn't do anything because that will make the crisis worse, an argument which is not crazy. But I think one of the doctrinal things that has to be worked on is for the unlikely contingency of a conventional invasion. How do you take advantage of strategic warning and make effective responses? I always like to recommend articles that I've read that sound interesting because there are not that many. Francois Eisbourg has written a brilliant article on, of all things, the French operation in Mali in survival. And one of the things he points out is that the French were able to operate with lightning speed. I mean, literally in a couple of days, they managed to turn the military situation in the country around. And one reason for this was that they had very small but very effective, very skilled, very ready forces deployed already not too far away. Now, they needed help to get the big forces from the United States, Britain, and it took a while. But they were able to get meaningful capability on the ground very quickly, which had a big impact. Now, it's not that Mali sets the example for everything, but it sets the principle that if you need to figure out ways to be ready to respond quickly and not to wait, as the French did in this case, for reasons of the circumstance, but not to wait until it's inevitable before you get ready.
Before I turn the floor over to participants in the audience, I want to ask Kurt one last political question about deterrence. It strikes me that the most likely contingencies in which NATO's deterrence capacity will be challenged is not some massive invasion by some Eastern party. I think those days are gone. It's more some lightning, unexpected strike by a terrorist organization or some radical regime well outside the North Atlantic area, or in the case of increasingly unstable Russia, if that trend continues, a limited territorial incursion. If we go back to Stefano Stefanini's quoting of Machiavelli, he emphasized the word punishment. If you're going to, an effective deterrent requires your aggressor to believe, or potential aggressor to believe, that there's going to be an immediate reprisal, a punishing reprisal. Does NATO have the capacity to do such a reprisal, to punish? I can understand NATO responding to a major incursion because it's politically unambiguous. But a more limited strike, a more limited incursion, does NATO have the political will to really strike back and demonstrate it's willing to strike back in a way that will actually deter that from happening?
Right. Well, I think you put your finger on the question, Ian. Do we have the capacity? Yes. Do we have the will? No. Do we have the track record? No. And have we messaged that this is what will happen if you do this? No. So that's where we kind of fall down. Again, just kind of laying out that spectrum. Nuclear deterrence, not worried about at the moment. Conventional deterrence of an attack like you're talking about, no worries there. Of an attack on a conventional attack on NATO territory. But these other things, I'm concerned that we're not in a position to deter them and that that's eroding. And it's sort of the trend line is the wrong way. I would love for us to be in a position to deter Syria from doing what it's doing, to warn them because they know what we'll do if they don't do what we warned them about. But that's just not the case today. And if it's a terrorist group as well, the capacity to go and identify through intelligence means and then to have precision-guided munitions to land on a terrorist training base or a government that may have provided support to that, yeah, we could do that. But it'd be more likely to be the U.S. that would do it, and I don't think NATO would have the will to agree to such a thing. It takes a consensus at NATO among all the allies, and then you have to define the operation and roles within it. I just don't see that, and so I think that means that as NATO, we really don't have that deterrent capability. If I could add one point, because I was listening and I was thinking about this, I don't see, and maybe it's just me and I'm a little thick here, I don't see missile defense as having a deterrent capability, other than making sure we are not deterred in our efforts to deal with a regional challenge. So it's about the example Walt gave again. If Iran is off doing something in the Middle East and they have a missile capacity, the fact that we know we could blunt that missile capacity would therefore mean we're not deterred from dealing with that Iranian challenge for that reason. Now, there'll be a dozen other reasons that we might be deterred from dealing with that. How complicated, how long it would be, what we get ourselves sucked into, and I think that's what we're seeing with Iran and Syria today. But I don't think that missile defense gives us an ability to deter someone else like Iran from doing that. All it means is that we're not deterred from intervening for that reason.
Okay, I'm going to open it up, and all I ask is keep your questions, well, first identify yourself, your affiliation, and keep your questions and points brief. Thank you. I'm going to start with Barry Pavel.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to the panelists for a really good discussion so far. I thought you raised a lot of the right issues. I did want to focus a little bit on this question of will, because I hear a lot from administration officials sort of off the record, as well as in some cases on, that we're war weary, which is true, and certainly parts of our military are war weary. But that, you know, there is the question of use of military force is essentially off the table for almost any type of contingency that you could imagine. I do think that sends the wrong deterrent signals, as Kurt has said, but I wonder how true that is. I mean, I would love the panel to talk about the American public. Are they convincible for certain contingencies and not others? Or is it just completely off the table forever? Is it only the Middle East? Sort of what are the dynamics at play that makes the American public now different from other times in our recent history?
Madeline, you want to take a shot at that?
Okay. I think, I think you have to balance what, I think you have to maybe balance a little bit what the American public is tired of. Yeah. And not what the will to do if it arose. Okay, and I think they're two very different things. So yeah, I think and we see it, that the American public is just very tired of intervening in places where they may not see a definite threat to the U.S. That said, I don't think that there's anybody that would say that if there were a definite threat to the U.S. wouldn't be there, or that there was a definite threat to a close ally, the U.S. wouldn't be there. I think they're two very different things. And certainly the way we train, the way everything that we're doing at DoD is certainly supportive of the fact that, yeah, we would respond if there were a definite threat to the U.S. or to our close allies.
Walt, because I know you have to go.
I have to go in a few minutes, and thanks for letting me. I think that one's attitude toward the demonstration of this problem is supposed to be Syria. That's the argument. That depends an awful lot on whether you think it was in fact a good idea or is still a good idea to intervene in the Syrian civil war. If you think intervening in the Syrian civil war is a good idea for a variety of reasons you find compelling, then the fact that the United States is not going to do it diminishes our credibility. Since I believe there is not a good argument for the United States intervening in the Syrian civil war, the fact that the American public and the Congress and the administration are pretty reluctant to do it is a very good thing. And indeed, I would argue that what the public will be convinced of is just exactly what Madeline just said. When it is genuinely in our interest to do something because the situation presents a serious challenge to ours and our allies' security interests and world stability and so on, then the American public is quite capable of being convinced. It takes leadership, it takes effort, not 100% of the people will be convinced. You will get to some degree the scenario we had in Kosovo, where on the same day the Republican-controlled House of Representatives voted against expanding our intervention, against terminating our intervention, and literally tied on whether we should continue to do what we were doing. It's not going to be easy to get Congress to act, if Congress has to act, or to get the political support. But I think the demonstrated restraint in not rushing into another Middle Eastern adventure actually helps the credibility of a future administration in a situation in which there was a much more clear-cut challenge. And with that, since I don't think the days have passed when airplanes waited for me.
You can't deter its departure.
Right.
Kurt?
Just to comment on that, if I could, because it glosses over a lot.
Well, you got a standing ovation.
I think I owe Kurt the courtesy of hearing his rebuttal.
It's okay, you can rebut me later. No, but it glosses over a lot where, we had a red line, we had Secretary Kerry saying that we would be responding to this use of chemical weapons. We had the president saying so, and then we didn't do so, and then we got off in a different direction. So I think it has had an impact on U.S. credibility. But the point I was making earlier wasn't about U.S., it was about NATO. What is NATO's credibility in having the will to respond to any of these number of scenarios? And that's where I think we really have a problem. Because I don't see the NATO that we have today willing to even contemplate a new expeditionary mission, to contemplate increases in defense spending. Even when we talk about exercising, we talk about what scenarios are you exercising, no one wants to talk about what the scenarios are. So I think that there's just a real concern that if NATO were confronted with a situation as NATO that it would need to respond to, unless it is that attack on the conventional normal attack on a territory of a NATO member, I would see it very, very difficult to get agreement at NATO on that.
Madeline, you want it?
Just sort of a quick, I'm not sure that that NATO responding always has to be in the context of NATO responding in a military way. So right now, because of the way the Syria situation has evolved, which one would argue has actually been or will be much more successful in getting rid of the chemical weapons in Syria than if we had initiated several airstrikes. So you have right now, as a result of the diplomatic solution, as a result of the Russian effort, the OPCW, the UN, our efforts in Syria, I mean, you've seen quite a bit of response from both NATO, Qua-NATO, and then NATO countries wanting to know what can they do to help, what offers can be made of assistance to make sure that Syria gets those weapons or gets the chemical capabilities outside of Syria, that they meet their deadlines under the OPCW and the agreed framework. I mean, they really are responding. I mean, almost to the point that you can't use everybody. So, I mean, I think there's NATO responding in many, many ways, and there is a will to respond, not just militarily.
Harlan?
Harlan Ullman. Thanks to the panel. My question is for General Cartwright. Jim, you've opened up the intellectual equivalent of a fine bottle of wine and given us a nice sniff. I'd like a bigger taste. Can you answer your own question about how do you deal with the strategic reality, especially when we're impelled by the fact that sometime before the end of 2020, and probably much sooner, buying power defense is going to be about half of what it is right now. So how would you answer your own question, what we ought to be doing in a few crisp sentences to give us that taste?
I would proffer an alternative triad, which would be a triad of strategic capabilities, general purpose force capabilities, and then to get at this issue of the nexus between terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, special operations capabilities. And the special operations capabilities are the ones that would be forward deployed and out and about. And they would be the intermediary between border and police and general purpose forces. And as the example that Walt used, they would be there in areas where we had worry about having strategic surprise or tactical surprise. And so then at that end of the capability, that's counterproliferation, non-proliferation, movement around, understanding what's going on. At the high end, on the strategic side, it is the missile defenses, it is the last resort of nuclear, but last resort, and credible capabilities of far-reaching effects, not all necessarily kinetic and not all necessarily military in nature, that allow us to have the time to have what appears to be one of the good I hate to use that word, things that have happened in Syria, which is the ridding of the region, particularly Syria, of those chemical weapons and all of the surrounding nations that have lived under that threat. I do disagree on the missile defense side of this. I do believe very clearly and very passionately that missile defense is in fact a deterrent. That when you remove, whether your adversary is a rational thinking nation state or person, or whether it is a totally irrational, undeterrable, so to speak, capability, that you can deter people by removing objectives. If you remove the objective of a cheap strike or a quick strike like that, taking in the middle of the night, what we used to worry about 300 ICBMs over the pole is now Scuds or whatever. If you put that threat in question, you are in fact adding a deterrent capability, I believe, to the equation. I don't think we disagree on how it would be used, but I call that a deterrent. But it is that triad and the rebalancing of your strategic forces, your general purpose forces, and your special operations.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make about the third leg of your triad, which is using special operations forces, and I'm wondering if there's a way that the alliance could bind its chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons brigade with the NATO response force, creating almost an anti-WMD capacity to go in and seize and secure WMD when necessary.
Well, the likelihood, I think the most important thing is to bring your border and internal police into close coordination and understanding, common picture with your special operators. And have special operators, no kidding, trained and equipped to handle non-proliferation, counter-proliferation, WMD type scenarios. That for each nation state is critical, but then for the region and the alliance is going to become a critical activity.
Interesting. Stefano?
Thank you, Ian. My question would have been to Walter Slocum, but is left. But it's a more general question. I think it's an issue we've been this panel especially has been circling around. What triggered was his remark about Iran. What we could expect from Iran is not from Iran missile capability, not so much an aggression toward NATO, but a regional crisis. I think we've seen a number of a scenario we've been confronted recently has been crises which, as they start, they do not affect NATO or Europe's security. But say Syria, say Libya, but as they go on, they can create situations, I mentioned the state failure, that becomes a threat to our own security. Do we have my question is, do we have the tools, the mindset really, to deter or at least prevent or contain crises before they are fully blown up?
Kurt?
And obviously, this question, tools cannot be, this kind of tools have to be wider than just military.
Well, again, you know, I think Madeline makes a good point. Not all NATO responses have to be military responses. But it's hard to find ones that NATO has actually done that have not involved some military response. The one thing I can think of that NATO has done with Syria is to reassure Turkey that any attack on Turkey would be met with military response. That gets right to the heart of this Article 5 territorial defense. But I have a hard time thinking of other things that NATO has done with respect to Syria. When you talk about crisis management and a broad set of tools, a lot of European allies have prevented NATO from developing that set of tools. I remember on Afghanistan fighting very hard just to try to get police training, because the EU said it was going to do police training, but didn't really do much police training, some, but not much. The Dutch were actually the standouts in this. And we had to find a way around to help NATO create the training for paramilitary police forces so that we could actually bring in other capacity. And then when you get beyond that, which is still a security-oriented one, The only things I can think of that NATO has been really successful at have been disaster relief and negotiations, where, say Secretary General Robertson or Solana before him would involve in a negotiation to try to politically dissolve a crisis. But largely, again, because of the way nations have thought about NATO for so long, we've never really developed one of the robust crisis management capacities separate from the military ones.
Kurt, how far do you want NATO to go beyond its core military missions? Beyond collective defense, because at a certain point you're going to sap up much political will. You're getting into realms that are not NATO's strong points. I mean, I'm struck by General Cartwright's idea we're leveraging SOF as an interface to facilitate other institutions' participation and to ensure integration with their efforts in non-military realms.
Well, I think that we had a good formula for this, which was you do your planning and exercising for a credible collective defense, and then as crises arise, if there's a consensus among NATO that we got to do something about this, as there was in Bosnia or as there was in Kosovo, you have the capacity there to do it. So you can't, in advance, pre-agree within NATO, we're going to be ready to go to Afghanistan. Can you imagine in 2000, if anyone had brought that up at NATO, it would be nonsense. Of course we're not going to Afghanistan. So you got to have the capacity that then, as events arise, you choose to deal with. What we said in 2002 was that we have to address challenges from wherever they may arise, threats from wherever they may arise, as opposed to on the territory of NATO countries. This is getting the out-of-area debate out the door. I don't think that NATO would say that again today and mean it. And I do think that's something we have to think about because it is global. These challenges can exist from anywhere. But I don't think we are thinking much about that. But the core is to restore the credibility, strengthen the credibility is maybe a better word, strengthen the credibility of our basic ability to do our basic job of collective defense, which is expeditionary for most countries, getting to where they're needed. And then you'll have the capacity on a case-by-case basis to respond to crises as they arise.
Great. I had a question in the back. Sir.
Hi, Paul Hilder from Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I have two questions. The first one is missing Walter Slocum as well, but it concerns the presence of U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe and the future of the debate within the NATO as an HLD and NPG. As Walter Slocum talked about the need to keep Europeans involved and educate them in the use and also the aspects of nuclear weapons. Yet, is it possible to imagine that debate being at the same level without U.S. nuclear weapons committed to NATO? And I ask because Brad Roberts once said, and I think it was on record, that Japanese are pretty envious of the Europeans because of this relationship that Europeans have, NATO allies have, because of these weapons. And the second question is somewhat briefer, and it goes to General Cartwright, and it picks up on your point about special forces. There's been a lot of attention in Europe on the withdrawal of the 2 brigade combat teams, but there has been very little attention to the fact that the US is actually boosting its special forces presence in Europe. So what are we seeing a more relevant US presence in Europe rather than just a smaller one? Thank you.
On the second, on the special operations, I mean, I don't know exactly the intent inside, and Madeline probably can address that better. But from a standpoint of relevance, I think that the special operations versus a heavy brigade today, for the reality that we live in, is going to be a lot more relevant to the defense capabilities of NATO and Europe.
I may dodge that one and go after the other one. But I mean, I think the NATO DDPR clearly put forth NATO's view with respect to NATO being a nuclear alliance, and the fact that there clearly are nuclear weapons that the U.S. has assigned to NATO is something that both the HLG, the NPG, the NAC, all the rest of the bodies in NATO continue to look at. and with a good deal of seriousness. So on the one hand, there's been some work, particularly over the last 6 months-ish, and the creation of the new Arms Control Committee, the ADNC, as well as with the HLG, when, the beginnings of, okay, what is it that we need to do to look at confidence building measures, to look at transparency measures in a way that will inspire some reciprocal actions on the part of Russia to begin to have this discussion about what would a foundation look like for reductions. So that's out there, but the commitment on the part of the allies, which I think was also part of this, it's really been very strong, and it's a commitment that is really respected in this notion of burden sharing. So at least in the context of the HLG, burden sharing has been a very important element of this, and we see good, strong consensus on that. So, and also in the context of the whole, U.S. nuclear commitment to NATO, there really is burden sharing. I mean, it isn't obvious on its face, but it really is. So, NATO common funding, you have individual nations, you have the U.S. I mean, then of course you have the individuals, the independent deterrent of the UK, which is also provided to NATO. So, it is a good and it is a pretty strong alliance. That said, the PPD that was just issued also made it very clear that the U.S. really is committed to extended deterrence. And that was not only the reassurance to NATO, but it was also the reassurance in the Middle East and also, frankly, most importantly, in the context of Japan and Korea. And that extended deterrence is there. And even though there aren't weapons there anymore, we've taken some actions, like the recent flyover of the B-2, to make it very clear that we are committed to this extended deterrence.
Madeline, if we went down to zero in terms of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, would we have to change our conventional force structure in any way?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I have to say that's, I mean, I live in my world of strategic deterrence. I don't venture out much into the conventional side, so that would probably be a conversation for a larger group. But it depends on how strong one would believe the deterrence is in the absence of those. In other words, would the extended deterrence still be strong enough if everything were pulled back to the U.S., that would be equivalent? If it were not seen as equivalent of the forward deployed deterrence, then you probably would have to do something on the conventional side. But if it were still seen as equivalent, then probably no.
John Cartwright?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that, and it's in the eyes of the beholder, so it may be true one way in one country and different in another, but from a purely military standpoint, my opinion, and I've said this multiple times, as has Ivo, is that any capability that is on the soil in Europe today can be replicated in kind and in availability from a standoff distance. That's really not a problem, and it's credible, probably to the extent more credible because it's safe, it's guarded, and it can be called forward when it needs to, and it can be substituted with something that's strategic and gets there fast. So from that standpoint, it's true. There is a value, though, to something that you can go pet and and say it's here and people practice, et cetera. And that's the political side of this equation, which is very important. In the Pacific, we've done it differently as a nation for the United States to what we have done in Europe. It can work either way. It really is in the eyes of the beholder and what our allies really feel they need to be convinced that we, in fact, will honor our extended deterrence commitments.
Kurt?
Just a final comment. I'm sorry to keep talking, but I think this raises a broader political problem with NATO again, which is we have gotten ourselves comfortable with the idea that allies can agree to a mission and assume that it doesn't mean them. So we agree that, yeah, NATO will take on this thing, but does it mean that I'm going to commit military forces to carry this out? And Libya is a great example where Germany pulls its forces away from the coast of Libya when the rest of us go to do something in Libya. And I think that's a dangerous direction for NATO to go in, because I think it creates this assumption that it's someone else's problem, and in many cases it's the US's problem. And I don't think NATO can really work that way. So one of the reasons why I have a different reaction to the question from the guy from the Norwegian Defense Institute is that if you didn't have the US nuclear weapons in Europe, I think a lot of European allies would say, well, nuclear policy is not our issue anymore. It's those guys' issue.
And one more question from Georgia.
Thank you, Matt Kutelli at the McCain Institute. I have one comment regarding the deterrent or preventive power of NATO, and I think the last history of the NATO enlargement, especially since the breakup of Soviet Union, clearly convinced that the enlargement policy was one of the strongest deterrent factor, and many crises potential been prevented because of the first launching the PFP and then subsequently waves of enlargement of NATO. And I think this process should continue in different forms and in different directions in Europe as well as globally. But my question now is about another integrational process that is happening on the Eurasian continent. This is an attempt of create a Eurasian Union, which former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton labeled as an attempt of recreation of the Soviet Union. And while the attempt is to cover this under the economic or the customs union format, we all remember that initially this idea was voiced as a Medvedev's Eurasian security initiative. But then they tried to be a little bit more smart and cover it under the economic umbrella. So what should be the NATO's position towards this type of involuntary or forceful attempt of to integrate different countries who once decided to break free from the Soviet regime? Thank you.
I think that falls more probably to Kurt.
Well, first off, Batu, I think you're right that enlargement was a great deterrent. Because when we enlarged, we were clear that we were serious about the collective defense aspect of it. So I think it was a tremendous success and reassurance, especially for countries like the Baltic states. And I think also the reverse is true. So the fact that we stumbled over Georgia kind of gave a green light, say they're not serious about Georgia. So I think you're absolutely right to weigh it that way. And then the third point that I would make, and I guess I would add it on to what you were saying, not contradicting it, both in the US and among our European allies, we kind of run out of steam. So that talking further, talking more about enlargement today is going to actually raise questions about your commitment. You know, are we really committed to extending our defense guarantee to more countries and more territories when our publics are fatigued, we're cutting our military forces, we're pulling back from operations? So is that really credible? So we have a lot of, I think, homework to do as NATO itself to rebuild some of the credibility so that we can be in the position of saying, now we're moving forward on enlargement and it is as ironclad as ever what NATO membership really means. I would like to see us start rebuilding that, start talking about the importance of completing a Europe whole and free, start talking about our desire to get there, the countries that are interested in that. But I think we also have to be realistic. We have to build that back up a bit.
Let me close our session by posing to our panelists one last question. And it could serve as kind of a framework for them if they have any closing remarks to our audience. If you were sitting in the White House today, and I guess Madeline's kind of sitting over there, what would you like to see come from the NATO summit that would fundamentally realign or reinforce the alliance's deterrence capacities? So I guess maybe I'll start from General Cartwright, then to Madeline.
This gives them a chance to think about it. You know, my sense, and I go back, realign the conventional capabilities so that they address not only the most dangerous, but the most likely, okay? Accept the fact that we're going to have to deal not only with nation states that are going to have crises, but we're going to have groups and individuals that are highly empowered and that they're going to be able to bring threat against nations, elements of the alliance that are going to have to respond. So I would be focusing particularly in Europe and in the alliance at capabilities that are addressing the most likely. The second thing, from my perspective, and I'm very much in line with Ivo's comments and others, we've got to bring down the reliance on nuclear as a strategic deterrent and increase the reliance on other capabilities, other tools, diplomatic and military, for strategic deterrence. And start to move for the technologies and the capabilities and the architectures that would allow us to have those kinds of capabilities at the strategic level to deter conflict and increase other options so that our statecraft options don't run out prematurely or are less than effective against a wide range of threats. We have to increase the tools in the statecraft to prevent these things.
Alan?
So I would say probably initially making sure that the financial commitments of each country continue to be sound. The ability of everybody I know is challenged at this point in time, but nevertheless, making sure that that is really still an element of membership in NATO, is that you really do commit to your defense goals. The second thing I would say is to really look at those things which could enable NATO writ large to take greater advantage, I think, of its various abilities, and to focus on some of the new strategic enablers. I mean, not necessarily new, but things that maybe NATO hasn't totally taken advantage of, things like cyber. You know, doing those things are important, making sure that even the NATO networks are solid and protected, that the networks of the NATO members are solid and protected. So all of these things that need NATO to be able to operate are there. So the comms are there, the networks are protected. And the other thing is really look at those things that right now are only in the province of one country to provide. So for the most part, I would say the U.S. provides most of the ISR. You know, so really looking at, is that really the way to balance some of these capabilities? You know, are there other countries that can provide other capabilities, other comms, other ISR assets? How do we spread some of this around so NATO isn't totally reliant on one country for one thing?
Great. General O'Reilly?
I would say that for them to take a fresh look at the threat in a way that's not static. I've spent a career listening to what is a real threat and what isn't. And about every 10 years it gets redefined, and real threats, non-real threats become real threats. Have the capacity to engage individuals, individual groups, surrogate groups, and look at the deterrence from a point of view, in some cases, unfortunately, where it isn't a state you're trying to deter, but it is a terrorist group. And in that case, I couldn't disagree more with Kurt's point that that doesn't have a deterrence effect. I think you need to be able to counter whatever the tools that a terrorist group tries to use, and just have that capacity.
Thank you. Kurt?
Mm-hmm. Well, three things. I would look for a renewed consensus on completing Europe whole and free, that we have to get that back together. That could mean an invitation or two to Montenegro, Macedonia, if the name issue could get resolved, but it could just be getting the allies together that this is where we want to go. Second, I would want to see a renewed commitment to exercising and planning the capabilities needed for NATO's Article 5 collective defense. We have a lot of the building blocks in place, and we need to put a strong package over that. We know we're going to be cutting. We know we're not going to do certain things. We're not going to shut down operations. So answering the question, what are you prepared to do, and putting that into concrete terms. And then the third thing is to be using NATO as a place to discuss the really raging crises that are going on around NATO. So Syria and Egypt and follow on in Libya and Iran and so forth. Because I think we've really drifted over 20 years or so from NATO being a central place where we dealt with challenges that we're all worried about to a place where we really don't talk about them strategically anymore.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me thank my panel for their comments and their insights. I think what they've demonstrated as a lot of people call conventional deterrence, nuclear deterrence, even missile defense is kind of the old thinking. Well, it's clear from our discussion is they're very relevant. They may be long-standing challenges and threats and tools that we have, but they're very, very linked to the new challenges that we face, be it cyber, be it terrorism, on other dimensions that define the strategic environment today. So with that said, let's give our panel a warm round of thanks. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Barry.
Thank you. I'll let our panel transition and just offer some brief closing remarks. And I thought that was a really great panel, so a big contribution. Thank you. So this is the midpoint of a project that, when you step back, is looking at a number of regional security issues, the region being Europe and its surrounding areas, that pretty clearly, at least as the U.S. strategic review that's underway right now, the Quadrennial Defense Review, it will not be pivoting towards this region, almost certainly in light of what I'm getting from the Pentagon. But I think over the last few years, and we've heard this on a number of the panels today, there's some very important alliance capabilities that have been used on multiple continents over the last couple of decades, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in South Asia, and who knows sort of where else it may be needed. So I think in terms of in light of the environment that we heard discussed in the first panel and at our first conference, clearly a very relevant capability. And so this focus today on deterrence and collective defense we thought was important, because deterrence and collective defense were really the linchpin of the alliance since NATO's inception in 1949. Now, the contours of the transatlantic relationship and the fabric of the security issues that we're dealing with are being strained a bit by the Syria issues, by the NSA scandals, by challenges in Afghanistan, et cetera. So in this environment, we think deterrence and collective defense still remain the crucial mandate of the alliance, and really an anchor of mutual transatlantic protection in a very uncertain world, in a world where we don't know where we'll be going next. And so we've spoken at length today about NATO being at an inflection point, certainly with the end of the Afghanistan mission and what it might be doing subsequent to that. I think we heard some important ideas today about that. And whether it's the 3 priorities that I suggested or whether it's other priorities, I think clearly, as Kurt Volker just suggested, there needs to be an answer to the question, sort of what is NATO going to be prepared to do, and thus how should it exercise and posture itself in order to do it. I think we also heard about the tools quite a bit. We heard the need to sustain a number of the traditional tools, nuclear weapons, missile defense, conventional posture, even in a very sort of untraditional environment. And then we heard about the growing role of other tools that are emerging, of cyber, of space, and of other non-military tools, which are increasingly important for crisis prevention and for crisis management as well. And I think it's really a question of how and how much do we accommodate in the deterrence toolkit, sort of smashing these new tools in and figuring out a way to wield them in ways that are most effective and efficient, especially in light of all of our budgets that are dropping or certainly facing some constraints. So that's my attempt at summarizing 5 hours of substantive discussion. There'll be more to come from the Atlantic Council and from our wonderful Norwegian partners at IFS. I want to thank them again. I wanted to thank our panelists. I also wanted to thank at the Atlantic Council Simona Kordosova and Robbie Grammer, who put all of this together, working all weekend and pretty much all month on setting this up. So thanks to them also, and thanks to all of you for your great questions and for your great comments. Thanks very much.